I am Brad Weber, the founder and president of InspiringApps, and I am joined by Stacy Griffin, our director of operations. Stacy, hello.
Hello. Thanks for
I just noticed that you are coming up on your 13th anniversary at InspiringApps. That is fantastic.
Hard to believe.
It's hard to believe. In that time, you have seen hundreds of web and mobile apps that our team has worked on. So I can think of no better expert to talk about budgets and cost control and providing some advice to those who are potentially dipping their toe into the app market. So shall we dive in?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, fantastic. So first, I thought we could explore the factors that affect app development costs. People come to us at different stages. Sometimes we're starting an app from scratch. Sometimes they're asking us to enhance something that's in place. Do you see that there are significant differences in the stages of app development and how that contributes to the cost?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's worth mentioning the types of clients that I'm used to working with, and it's a wide variety. We have the enterprise clients, which are Fortune 100 companies that come to us and want an app built with specific features, and then all the way to startups that have a very MVP style approach. And we do try to use that approach with all our clients, but some, for varying reasons and budgets, have different needs. So the more complex the app is, the more features, the more functionality, the more intricate design, that obviously is going to increase the cost. A lot of times we'll try to start with, what are the base use cases that you want to solve? What are the issues that you want to solve first, and get something out in front of the users earlier and more cheaply so that we can get that feedback and that can drive the direction. That doesn't always work because sometimes clients have, for good reasons, a lot of use cases that they need to solve. For security reasons, if they have payment processing, it just is more complex. And so there's more integrations and things like that. But I think trying to start as small as possible is the best approach. And that's kind of scary for clients sometimes because they don't want to put anything out there that may not satisfy their user base.
You said for good reason, sometimes the apps get more feature rich or maybe more complex. Do you find that sometimes that happens for not such good reasons?
Yeah, for sure. Sometimes you look at something and your design team wants to build out every component of it. And so sometimes it's our own doing, like we need to scale it back and bring things back in and think about things in smaller chunks. And I think agile methodology has done a lot to move that needle that way rather than waterfall where you design everything. We are a client service company, so sometimes we have to look at the broader scope and then bring it back in ourselves. Our clients always want to know, well, what's the cost going to be of my full vision, and then bring it back in and in and in to build something and do it in a more iterative approach.
That was great. Thank you. Are there patterns from project to project that make one project more complex than others? Or are there things that you see that when you hear it, that this is going to increase the budget or the requirements for the project?
Yeah, sometimes it's platform compatibility. If they want to build something that goes across web, Android, iOS, every platform, that's going to cost more. In something that may sound like it would cost less, if they have their own backend team, just because of that integration and working across different teams, sometimes that increases the cost. It's not development hours of actually key on the keyboard, but it's just more facilitation and things like that. Those are things that I think people don't realize that it's like a one-to-one savings, right? If they swap in their backend team for our backend team, but that is not always the case. So I would say platform compatibility, integrations, like third-party integrations with social media or different frameworks can increase the cost as well, like mapping services or payment gateways, things like that.
That makes sense. Those are great examples. Thanks. So you mentioned an MVP or trying to start small. I think that's an example of a best practice that we try to promote with clients. Maybe that's an area that we could explore some more. Are there other, either you can look at it as the positive side, best practices that we're promoting, or pitfalls that we're trying to avoid in terms of budgeting appropriately and avoiding unnecessary costs?
Well, let me point this out a little bit. I think I said that large companies and Fortune 100 companies can do the MVP approach, but that doesn't always happen. And I think it's because of the level of stakeholders, right? Like they don't have in some cases as much control over their stakeholders because there's so many different silos. Whereas if you have a startup, they're making the decisions usually. It's like 1 or 2 or 3 people that are making those decisions. So it's much easier to get that MVP approach, to pare down and to do multiple iterations. And also some of it is us being able to sell our ability to get things done for them. Because sometimes they think, well, I've got their attention. We need to get as much in this pipeline for this dev company as possible. But it's much better for us if we can just focus on it for 4 to 6 weeks and get them something. Then they go and they play with it, or they get it in front of their user groups, and then they come back to us. So I think it's building trust on both sides of the fence for that.
You talked about the importance of user feedback. So can you explore that a little bit more? I think that, is it fair to say that all of our customers come feeling like experts in the problem that they're trying to solve?
I think so. I think most of our customers play the role of product owner, if we're talking in agile terms. And so I think they do. And I think that's what we want. When we back up a little bit, we want them to really understand their users. Sometimes there's varying levels of that actual understanding, because sometimes it's a personal mission for this app, and maybe it's not been as tested in the wild. And that's what that MVP really can help you do. And we've done some stuff with clickable prototypes, but it's just not quite the same, because I think it's just like mentally not quite the same, because you can't really use it. You can't really do what you want. So a user's level of engagement with it is a little bit different. Not that I discredit, I think it's a valuable tool as well. It's really cost effective and there's no skin in the game necessarily. So both are warranted, but just because they love your clickable prototype doesn't necessarily mean that they'll love the app.
And for somebody who's not familiar with that term, how would you describe a clickable prototype?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's basically taking a wireframe or a design and then adding like kind of hot buttons so that you can tap different areas and it'll advance the screen. But to the user, it almost looks like it's a functioning app.
So they can take it for a test drive without having to build the fully functional car.
Yeah. And sometimes it's an excellent tool to test UI and UX. Sometimes there's functionality it's really hard to introduce in that way. And it's also a very like happy path through the app. It's hard to do like varying different workflows in the app.
Yep, that makes sense. So occasionally I've seen the people who come, as I said, feeling like experts in the problem space. Obviously, they're domain experts when they come to us. They often feel like they know exactly what users are going to want in that space. What I've seen over and over again is that once an app is released and it's in the hands of real users in their industry, they're often surprised by the things that users find important or valuable that may be different from what their original vision is. Is that something that you observed as well?
Yeah, definitely. And that goes back to not building every last thing into your initial release and building the MVP and then having the budget and just the kind of the understanding that this isn't it. Like we got something out quickly. Let's see what they want. Let's see where, because I thought that this was the order of the features that I wanted to work through, but the users have reprioritized things. I also think that takes pressure off of the product owner. Like they're not the only person making those decisions. They can point to somebody else or hopefully a whole group of people that have said, no, this is really what's important for us. It also boils down to making them pull things out. Like really, what is the true point of this app? Let's tackle that first. And what you thought was like pulling in contacts from every different system you think in your mind is the biggest thing for this app, when really people just want to make calls and build a contact list or something like that.
That's a great example. You talked about not including everything at once. You get the user feedback. I think another important point that you added there is that it's not a one and done.
Right.
For a successful app, you're not going to release a version 1 and not have a version 1.1 or a version 2. That's what you're signing up for, is to continue to support users. Can you talk about that iterative process after the first release? What does that look like for somebody who's trying to build a successful app?
Yeah. So typically what we'll do is we'll work in kind of a Kanban format. So you're just pulling off of a to-do list, and we have like a backlog of tasks that designs are ready for them. Developers are really comfortable with the scope of work. So it's a few weeks worth of work and just work through that as quickly. Demoing to the client is very important so that we know not necessarily giving the client the app to have on their phone, but just demoing, this is what we've done, just to get their feedback. Our designs are always gorgeous, but sometimes you get them in on a form factor and it doesn't always translate 100%. So sometimes you want to make tweaks. And so being able to demo that and getting that in front of clients early is great. And then getting those in front of the users is even better quickly. So we'll build out a list, a task list that everyone is very comfortable with the scope of work. The client is like, yes, this is what we want to release. And release doesn't mean it goes to the wild. That just means it goes to their user group. And then they go and they get feedback on that. And that can last, that could be weeks, could be months. That's totally up to the client. And then they'll come back to us with a new scope of work. The initial designs are done. So this process goes much faster than that first initial engagement with us. And we're just doing the next phase of features. And then we'll rescope that work and go down the same process. And we've already have a relationship that works. We've had a retrospective with the client. We know where we need to make adjustments, cadence maybe, or more or less meetings in person or whatever that is. So it's building on the relationship rather than starting brand new. Back in the old days, they'd have a bigger engagement with us. And then we'd say, save 20, 25% of the cost of the budget for maintenance and updates. Does it really work that way or that well, right? Like what you need at the end is always a little bit more. Your adjustments are just that much more costly, right? Because you built everything at once and then you're going back and making updates. Usually, not always, but that's the old way we used to do it. And now we do it in like much smaller chunks.
That makes sense. And you had talked about relationship building, and it reminded me that one of my favorite questions to get from a new client is, how can I be a great client for you? And I think there are a couple of things that are really behind that question. One is they want the process to go smoothly, or they want this to be pleasant for everyone involved, ourselves included. But part of it too is to make sure that it's efficient and cost effective. And so for clients that ask that question, do you have some top tips that you could share with them, the things that they can do and things that Inspiring Apps can do collaboratively with them to try to make sure that their project goes through smoothly and minimizes costs along the way?
Yeah, I think number one is availability. If we have a client that is available to answer questions, think through things, talk through things with us, that is key to everything going better, faster, hitting what they want better. So client availability is key. And there's some things we do to try to facilitate that. We try to meet with a client at least once a week. That's a time where the developers are there and we can demo to them and they can really get to know our team and feel comfortable asking questions. A client that goes quiet, I can't really think of a time where that's worked out great. It seems great because then we're just going along doing what we want to do, but then you're coming back through and making changes that are much more costly at the end rather than at the beginning. Even if we're talking about an MVP style where you're only a month in, it's still much better to get check-ins weekly with the client. I think just to piggyback on that same thought process is a client that speaks up and doesn't wait until the end and just say, oh, I never really felt right, but I thought it would get better. You want to hear that stuff up front. And then a client that kind of stays the course, right? So if they're switching gears all the time, that's no fun. That goes for any type of project, internal, external, whatever. You need to have a vision and stick to the vision. Or if you're going to switch from the vision, this is a whole new thing, then we're just completely switching the direction we're going in, which is fine, but we just need to have an understanding that that is a complete switch and change of course.
That makes sense. So is there, naturally at some level, there has to be a trade-off, but when you think about the trade-off between the cost, if I'm trying to keep my cost down on a project, but I also want a really high quality product at the end, are there ways that you think about delivering both of those to customers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we have a lot of potential customers, and customers are talking to offshore companies or they're talking to offshore developers. And that's one way to cut costs, right? Is to use less experienced development team or a development team that there are some logistical challenges. But that isn't always proved to be less cost right at the end. So there's also been instances where people are using an offshore company and we're bidding against them and we bid much lower because maybe it's more cost per hour, but we're building it faster. So those are things that people come in and they are always asking what our rate is or things like that. And there's more to think about there. There's expertise and experience and things like that that'll just lead to a better product in the end. Another way is our designs always look great, but I think you can do things in a more, let's worry about the animations later. Let's worry about some of the more costly things. Let's actually address accessibility in the first release and then put off some of the more bells and whistles towards the end once we figured out some things, because it may shift. I talked already a little bit about the third-party integrations. Sometimes we don't necessarily need to integrate with every way of authenticating into an app, right? Maybe we don't need Apple and Google and Facebook and all the things. We can just pick one or our own authentication service. And we also talked a little bit about platform compatibility. Maybe pick one single platform, release that, and then have your next phase. So let's say we do iOS and then have Android follow, where we've already learned everything we need to learn on one platform, and then come in with the next platform, if that's possible. It's not always possible for what clients need, things like that.
Yeah, I think your comment about the total cost of the app is an important one for people to consider. I'm reminded of a quote that I love from a colleague of mine over 20 years ago. At the time, he said, a $200 an hour developer is less expensive than a $25 an hour developer. He said, I know, I've been both. So there really is a significant difference, I think, more than people can imagine, in the quality and the throughput, the efficiency of an experienced developer over somebody who is new. And knowing the problems to avoid up front, it may feel like it's more expensive in the beginning, but if an experienced team or experienced developer is able to lead you down the right path such that you're not having to redo work, that's something that I found in my experience really saves in the long run. As expected, Stacy, you've been a font of wisdom. Are there any other topics you think related to app development, particularly around budget control and cost management for projects, that you think we should share?
Yeah, I think just high level, a common pitfall might be to lose sight of what you're really wanting to build and focus more on like the tertiary things that may not be the biggest bang for the buck or what you want to get out first. I think defining a realistic budget is important. I think that's something that we work through with our clients, and we offer some really good options for clients as far as ways that they can get their budget and maybe satisfy things without cutting the cost to a point where they get an app that's just not usable for them or doesn't meet any of their needs. Obviously, the better requirements, doing the work up front always makes for a smoother path through the process. And sometimes it can make for a really lengthy discovery phase of a project where we're really working, going back and forth and refining the requirements. But I've always felt like that is time well spent, and it saves so much on the development side of things, and it saves so much time on that side of things. And then transparent communication and collaboration. I'll just put a finer point on that. Both sides being very available for each other makes for a much better product in the end too.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Stacy. I
Yeah.
appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.